Hello and welcome to lecture 8 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on economic growth and development. We are continuing with the discussion on the strategies of various economic development and growth models. In the last class, we looked at the model of balanced growth and the unbalanced growth. The balanced growth strategy has mostly been forwarded as a doctrine, and the challenges posed to the balanced growth model in the form of unbalanced growth strategy was also discussed in the last class. The last class was planned in such a manner that in the beginning we started with discussion of a few basic concepts. We looked at who saves, who invests. We went into some conceptual clarity with regard to the concept of savings and investment. We also looked at some of the basic concepts that are used in economics to be able to understand growth models, such as the marginal private costs, marginal external costs, and the marginal social costs. And we also saw how they give rise to external economies and also externalities as we understand them in economics. After initiating some of the basic concepts, we looked at the balanced growth doctrine proponents. In lecture 5, we had gone into the details of Ragnar Nurks's contribution to balanced growth doctrine. In the last lecture, in lecture 6, in lecture 7, we looked at the contributions of Rosenstein-Rodin and Arthur Lewis. We saw that Rosenstein-Rodin had come up with a formulation of the balanced growth model, particularly in the context of Eastern and Southeast European countries. He was posing it as a problem of underdevelopment of these countries, which were completely cut off from foreign investments, and he was looking at international division of labor and how complementarities in demand and supply can be created for the large agrarian labor force existing in the eastern and southern eastern European countries. We also looked at the propositions of Arthur Lewis, in which he was talking about balanced growth or balanced development between different sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, and the international trade sector, or the foreign as far as the exports are concerned. So what we were basically trying to do as a part of balanced growth doctrine was that we saw that there are different forms of strategies that have been proposed as a part of this doctrine, and there are a lot of differences in the way this doctrine has been proposed. However, in the standard economic literature, they are all put together in the form of balanced growth doctrine. A large part of last class was also devoted to the challenges posed by the unbalanced growth strategists, and in the unbalanced growth model we looked at mainly Albert Hirschman's contribution to the unbalanced growth strategy, although we in passing discussed that there are various proponents, and some of the three most important proponents are Hirschman, Singer, and Paul Streeton. As far as Hirschman's thesis of unbalanced growth strategy is concerned, he was more for creating of imbalances within the economy through creation of convergent series of investments or divergent series of investments, and his proposal was that convergent series of investments are something which are largely taken by the private entities, the private enterprises. The divergent series of investments are taken up by the public agencies, and the question was to choose which path of development will create a smooth process of economic development, and his proposition was that this can be done by creating investments through excess capacities, by creating infrastructures like social overhead capital, or creating shortages by investment in directly productive activities taken up by the private firms. So essentially what he was proposing was that if social overhead capital is created in the beginning, then the private entities will be able to take advantage or appropriate the economies of scale that are created by the social overhead capital, and it will be easier for them to invest in directly productive activities and hence create output for final consumption. However, if investments are first made on directly productive activities by creating shortages of social overhead capital, then it will be difficult for the private entities to carry on with investments, because they have to put the pressure back, political pressure back on the governments to be able to create social overhead capital. And the economic system works in such a manner that it is essentially difficult to carry out investments in social overhead capital after creation of directly productive activities or output through directly productive activities. So the best way forward that was proposed by Professor Hirschman was to be able to ensure that there is massive government investments in social overhead capital, which will then create more output, and the development path can then move on to directly productive activities, ultimately leading to a growth of national income or gross national product. After the proposition made by Hirschman with regard to investment in social overhead capital, we also looked at Hirschman's focus on carrying out investments in only those industries which have the maximum linkages. So he was talking about identifying industries which have forward linkages and backward linkages, so that simultaneous investments can be carried out in various industries. So it was important that we look at the total linkages that are being created in the economy by adding up the backward linkages and the forward linkages. Now, today's lecture we will focus on Schumpeter's analysis of growth and Rostow's stages of growth theory. In the last class, I had given you a snapshot or a timeline of development thinking that has come to be since the late 19th century. And if you look at the timeline of development thinking, we can probably put Schumpeter's analysis of growth in the category of development thinkers that looked at development as universal history. And of course, Rostow's stages of growth is one of the most important structural models of growth that have come to be. So in this class, this class is divided into two, is planned in such a manner that I'll be focusing on two strategies of development or growth, if you may like to call them. One is Schumpeter's analysis of growth, the second is Rostow's stages of growth. And after discussing the major characteristics of these two strategies of development, I will again go back to clarifying some of the basic concepts that are important to understand growth models, and that are important to understand lectures in economics, since and this is for the benefit of all students coming from different disciplines. Joseph Schumpeter can be identified as a political economist, and he lived between 1883 and 1950. He was an Austrian economist and later went into Harvard and settled in USA. His major influences surround the ideas of what we today know is evolutionary economics. He's also written widely on the history of economic analysis. Towards the later part of his career, he was writing on business cycles, engaging a lot with Keynesian economics, and taking from Marxian study on capitalism. He also had a great deal to say about the demise of capitalism. However, a large part of his focus was on entrepreneurship and innovations. And some of you who are conversant with some of the basic textbooks of microeconomics would know that when we are introduced to the study of factors of production, the most common examples of factors of production that are taken up are land, labor and capital. And many of you would see that in the later years the term organization also started getting added on to the very basic factors of production. This term organization or entrepreneurial activities within the economy, that is a crucial factor of production, is the contribution of Professor Schumpeter to economic analysis. Now consider this situation, that in the early 1960s, Ghana and South Korea were almost at similar levels of development. However, South Korea, the East Asian country, went on to become one of the most industrialized countries of the world, whereas Ghana continued to be one of the most underdeveloped African countries. South Korea advanced to such a great degree that it ended up providing developmental aid and assistance to many African countries, whereas Ghana has gone through a series of frustrating coups. There has been economic stagnation and negligible participation in the global trading system, in spite of they having gold mines and world-class cocoa plantations. So these images basically talk to us about inequality existing in the world. Now, if one has to talk about economic transformation taking place or inequalities getting bridged, it is not this is not a thesis which emerged most recently, Professor Schumpeter can be given the credit of talking about economic transformation well ahead of time, and the seeds of rapid economic transformation, the ideas of rapid economic transformation, he brought out in his seminal work, which in the form of a book which came out in 1911, titled The Theory of Economic Development, an inquiry into profits, capital, credit, interest and business cycle. So in this book was considered to be groundbreaking. In this book, Schumpeter outlined a very important role of innovation and entrepreneurship in economic development. He was in fact making a very bold attempt in departing from the existing theories of economic equilibrium that dominated classical economics text of this time. And Schumpeter's work was appropriately called the theory of economic development because it described a world that is analogous to large parts of today's emerging countries. In fact, Schumpeter's ideas on entrepreneurship and innovations have been largely concerned in the context of, has been largely talked about in the context of the emerging countries. At first glance, it would appear that the lack of application of Schumpeter's ideas to emerging countries was a historical oversight, given that most of them were colonies at the time of his writing. However, these countries were desperately searching for alternative development models that would free them from dependence on their former colonial masters. Now, Schumpeter was writing during the ascendancy of neoclassical economics, and that placed considerable emphasis, neoclassical economics placed considerable emphasis on mathematical equilibrium models, and Schumpeter was constantly rejecting them. He tried to frame economic development as an evolutionary process. So he was laying the foundations of looking at economics as a very complex system. It is therefore not surprising that Schumpeter's work has been consistently excluded from compilations of studies on economic development, although it has seen a re-emergence in the 1990s, particularly with the coming in of the new growth theory and growth models, where innovations have been playing a very, the knowledge economy, the emergence of the knowledge economy in contributing to economic growth and not just human capital formation. Schumpeter's of course, he's written widely on this subject till his death in 1950, but some of the most important things with regard to ideas with regard to Schumpeter's theory of economic development that are discussed are the following. The one is circular flow, second is the role of entrepreneur or the role of entrepreneur as a change agent, the third is the cyclical process or business cycle, and the fourth is end of capitalism. Schumpeter, taking from Marx, was also talking about the end of capitalism through the process of what he liked to call is creative destruction. Now, what is this complex system? The economy as a complex system that Schumpeter was talking about. Schumpeter was mostly concerned with overall system transformation in the same way that his critics wanted to see rapid economic change in emerging countries. So he pioneered the application of complex systems thinking to economic development, and he was mostly concerned at looking at development or change over time, which is why he adopted an evolutionary approach that recognized the importance of history. Now, his idea was that, okay, there is static equilibrium, which the neoclassical economists were also talking about, and what were the components, what were the major characteristics of this static equilibrium? There is a circular flow that is taking place within this model. First is that there are economic activities taking place in this static equilibrium model, and these economic activities are essentially repetitive and they follow a familiar routine course. So there is a group of suppliers, and there are a group of the producers and consumers. All the producers know the aggregate demand for goods and they adjust the supply of output accordingly. This means the demand and supply are in equilibrium at each point of time, and the production processes are such that the economic system is producing an optimum level of output and its maximum use, and there is no possibility of wastage of resources, and the firms are working in a state of competitive equilibrium. Under the stationary equilibrium situation, the prices are equal to the average cost, and this is the circular flow of economic activities that is taking place within this static setting. Now, given this static setting, he proposes that to make it dynamic and consistent with development, changes must take place in the flow system. changes must take place in this equilibrium system, and these changes can be brought through innovations. When he is talking about innovations, he is talking about different kinds of innovations here. There may be innovation in terms of introduction of a new product, or there may be introduction of a new method of production, or opening up of new markets, or finding new sources of supply of raw materials and semi-manufactured goods, or carrying out of new organization of any industry, like the creation of a monopoly. Definitionally, when he was talking about innovation, he basically meant that there is a change in the existing production system, and that is to be introduced by the entrepreneur with a view to making profits and reducing costs. So this concept of innovation is closely linked with Schumpeterian concept of development. He is mostly, some of the key elements here are that first, he considers the process of economic development to be endogenous and driven by the creation of new combinations, including new products, new production methods, new organization forms, new markets, new sources of raw materials and inputs. And second, these combinations are carried out by entrepreneurs who are motivated to undertake certain actions. Thirdly, the entrepreneur is the change agent here, whose actions disturb the static equilibrium that we have just discussed before, this steady state, and they cause economic discontinuities. And finally, there will be the emergence of credit providing institutions such as the governments that play a key role in stimulating entrepreneurial activities. In his view, it is the credit providing institutions that take risks by providing funding to entrepreneurs. Let me repeat this system of circular flow proposed by Schumpeter once again. So he is saying that he is giving a very key role to entrepreneurs and innovations in creating disequilibrium within this circular flow system. And like the neoclassical economists, he is also beginning his analysis with a static equilibrium position. And the static equilibrium position is a competitive equilibrium where the producers and the consumers are in full information about what is happening in the market. The producers know what is the aggregate demand for goods, and they have adjusted their supply of output accordingly. Therefore, there is a demand and supply equilibrium at each point of time. And the economic system is producing optimum level of output, and there is no wastage of resources anywhere, which means that there is full employment equilibrium in this system. Now, given this circular flow of economic activities that is happening within this competitive equilibrium system, if there is something that needs to make it dynamic and consistent with development, if economic development has to take place, some kind of creative destruction must happen, and this creative destruction or these changes can be brought through the role of innovations. And innovations have to be carried out by the entrepreneurs is what his proposition is. And this innovation can be of various kinds. The innovation can be in the form of a new product or new production processes. It can be identification of new markets, finding of new markets, or finding out new sources of supply of raw materials and semi-manufactured goods, and so on and so forth. And there are certain special characteristics that this entrepreneur or innovator is supposed to be possessing in the Schumpeterian analysis of the process of development. The entrepreneur occupies the central place in the development process because he initiates development in a society and carries it forward. And he is very cautious in telling us that entrepreneurship or entrepreneur is very different from managerial activities of the organization. It is not that the organization has a staff and there are managerial activities being carried out by the staff. The entrepreneur is someone here who is a risk taker and who is much superior than the managerial staff carrying out their everyday managerial tasks. The entrepreneur is someone who gets a lot of joy out of creating, getting things done, or simply of exercising his energy and ingenuity. And there are a number of things that are necessary for the performance of this entrepreneurial function. The one is, of course, that there should be proper technical know-how. It should be available to the entrepreneur for introducing new products and new combinations of factor products. Capital resource should be made available to the entrepreneurs through the banks and other financial institutions, because credit is one of the factors that enables the entrepreneur to buy producers' goods which he needs for conducting of new experiments and innovations. There is also a role of profits as far as the function of the entrepreneur is concerned. He says that why does an entrepreneur innovate? The entrepreneur innovates because he wants to earn profits, and profits are conceived as a surplus over costs here, a difference between the total receipts and outlay. So profits arise due to the dynamic changes resulting from and innovation. So the static equilibrium constitutes a circular flow, and to be able to break this circular flow, some amount of dynamism needs to come into this system, into this static equilibrium model, and this dynamism can come in by breaking the circular flow, by bringing in innovations and providing a key role to the entrepreneur. So his theory of economic development basically says that it is a dynamic, economic development itself is a dynamic and discontinuous process, and society progresses through trade cycles, and in order to break the circular flow, the innovating entrepreneurs are financed by bank credit expansion. Schumpeter took example of the emergence of railroads as one of the ways in which creative destruction can take place. In his Schumpeter's disruptive model was railroads, which is a key infrastructure that had profoundly transformed the world he studied. For Schumpeter, railroads were not just a source of economic development, but also a driving force in improving human welfare. And now railroad expansion did not involve creating new technologies, but deploying existing ones. What did it involve? It involved the leadership of groups in successfully dealing with politicians and local interests, in the solution of problems of management and of development in the regions of the roads opened up. So the entrepreneurial function was performed by either individuals or groups of people whose tasks were unrelated to the act of taking financial risks. So Schumpeter's example of railroads has two important policy implications. First is that it underscores the importance of physical infrastructure in emerging countries, and such infrastructure and the associated institutional changes creates opportunities for entrepreneurs not only to participate in its construction, but also to expand opportunities for new businesses. The second implication is that infrastructure transforms the economic system in a discontinuous way by not only disrupting previous economic practices, but also by expanding opportunities for new economic combinations. In his later writings, Schumpeter also brought in the idea of business cycle, largely influenced by Keynes, and however, Schumpeter's approach to business cycle is historical and statistical and analytical. He believed that it is not just economic factors that contribute to the operation of the business cycle or a crisis, but also non-economic factors. And Schumpeter concluded that crisis is the process by which economic life adapts itself to the new economic conditions. He was often making reference to economic sociology, and he was saying that there's a lot of non-economic factors that go on to the creation of business cycles within the economy. So he was also talking about the boom periods and the depression periods. During the boom period, the new products start appearing in the market with entrance of new entrepreneurs. The old ones disappear, and consequently the prices of old products fall, but that also leads to a decline in investment and leads to unemployment, and therefore there is a fall in aggregate demand within the economy, giving rise to uncertainty and risks. And then a wave of pessimism sweeps the entire economy, the boom periods end, and the depression phase starts. Schumpeter believed in the existence of long waves of upswings and downswings, and once the upswing ends, according to him, the long wave of downswing begins and the painful process of readjustment starts, and the economic forces of recovery come into operation and ultimately bring about a revival. Drawing from Marx, Schumpeter was also talking about the end of capitalism. However, there is a difference between Marxian theory of end of capitalism and Schumpeter's analysis of the end of capitalism. Marx was basically talking about the overthrow of capitalism by a class of proletarians, but Schumpeter was talking about the end of capitalism because of institutional decay within capitalism. And these were some of the important points that he was trying to make. First is the obsolescence of the entrepreneurial function. Schumpeter observed that the success of early captains of industry have made innovation a routine activity. It tends to degenerate into a dispersonalized routine activity carried on in a business through trained managers. Therefore, the entrepreneurial function itself decays. There may be destruction of institutional framework, which was another factor responsible for weakening the foundations of capitalism. The entrepreneur, by his own success, may tend to destroy not only his economic and social functions, but also the institutional framework within which he works. And another way in which this may become possible is the destruction of protecting political strata. With the progress of capitalism, not only the functions of the entrepreneur and the institutional framework of capitalism crumble, but the group that protected early capitalism politically is also destroyed. So basically, how do we fit Schumpeter's analysis of economic development within the larger canvas of growth and development? In the larger canvas of growth and development, we can categorize Schumpeter under the development thinkers who looked at development as universal history. That there is that economic development can be analyzed in an evolutionary process, and Schumpeter was giving a very big role to innovations and the entrepreneur. He says that in a static equilibrium where the producers and the consumers are in a static equilibrium where demand is equal to supply and there is full employment of resources, there is no resource wastage taking place in the economy. Economic development can take place only if there is constant dynamism within the economy, and this dynamism can be provided not just by human capital formation but by the role played by a superhuman who is basically in the form of an innovator or an entrepreneur. So that was the importance he was giving to entrepreneurship. And there are through this formulation, he was also trying to say that he was trying to lay a lot of emphasis on the idea of human capabilities and government intervention or government support that should be provided to the private entrepreneur to be able to take the risks and create discontinuity within the economy by disturbing the static equilibrium and bringing about economic development. In his later writings, he started writing about business cycles, but he was one of the economists who was giving a lot of importance to non-economic factors that may create business cycles. And this is how we can sum up Schumpeter's analysis of economic development, that it is innovations and support to innovations that can bring about economic development within a country. However, if we look at the debate of the development of the 1950s and the 1960s, you would see that very little attention has been given to Schumpeter's ideas, and particularly in the context of the emerging countries. And the core of the rejection was basically an epistemological clash between Schumpeter's systems approach to economic transformation and that of his critics who adhered to a more static, linear and incremental view of economic change. So Schumpeter's central themes of innovation and entrepreneurship focused on endogenous transformation and evolution of economies, while his critics, who focused on the importance of central planning, relied on equilibrium models reflected in the role of bureaucracies as economic sources of stability. Now, after having looked at the basic ideas of Schumpeter, let us now move on to Walt Whitman Rostow. In the last class, we categorized Rostow as one of those thinkers who proposed classical theories of economic development, who looked at linear stages of growth models. And Rostow was one of those very influential thinkers of the 1950s and 1960s who viewed the process of development as a sequence of historical stages. And the view popularized, and this view was largely popularized by Rostow, and he was writing after the Second World War, and he proposed his stages of growth theory as a non-communist manifesto, which is supposed to bring about a modern economic history under capitalism. Rostow was introducing theory of growth in 5 universal stages, and his proposition was that all countries will necessarily pass through these 5 stages. So this was he was building on a historical pattern of the then developed countries, and his claim was that transition from underdevelopment to development would necessarily pass through these 5 stages, that of the traditional society, the preconditions for takeoff, the period of takeoff, the drive to maturity, and the age of high mass consumption. And the decisive stage is the takeoff stage, through which developing countries are expected to transit considered to be necessary to induce per capita growth. So basically his proposition was that all countries, and this was based upon the experiences of the then developed countries at the time when the debate on growth and development was taking momentum. These are necessarily the 5 stages that the countries will pass through. And let us look at what are the characteristics of these 5 stages. And let me also bring to your attention at this point that a lot of discussion has gone on with regard to various country categorizations, that whether they have reached the takeoff stage and what happens after the takeoff stage. So there is a lot of debate and literature surrounding this idea of takeoff, and whether some countries have taken off, and if some countries took off, what are the conditions or what are the preconditions under which they took off, and if some countries have not taken off, what are the conditions under which they could not take off. So let us now look at some of the characteristics of each of these 5 universal stages that Rostow was talking about. The first was he was talking about a traditional society. A traditional society is one of the simplest and primitive forms of social organization, and the major characteristics of this traditional society are that they have very low per capita incomes, there is a very limited range of available technology, and there is a ceiling on per capita output, low ceiling of per capita output. Second important characteristic was that a very large proportion of the workforce in this society is employed in agriculture, and they are devoted in the production of agricultural goods. High proportion of resources are also developed in the are also devoted to the agricultural section. And a careful look at these characteristics will tell you that most of the so-called underdeveloped or less developed countries of the world qualified to be categorized under this traditional society. The third important point was with regard to social mobility, that there is very less mobility as far as the social status of individuals within this traditional society is concerned. In other words, the traditional society is very hierarchical, hereditary, status oriented social structure. In the Indian context, you can think of caste as one of the indicators of the hierarchy that probably Rostow is talking about. So which means that in a traditional society it is almost impossible for people to change, to people to move from one social hierarchy to another. Another characteristic of traditional society was political power. The center of gravity of political power is localistic, region bound, and primarily based on land ownership. So the more land ownership, the more the political power. So it is asset based land ownership. It is not very democratic in nature. And when the movement from the traditional society to the preconditions for takeoff stage takes place, then there are certain progressive elements that must have creeped into this otherwise barbaric and primitive psyches of members of society. So people are trying to break free from the rigidities of the traditional society and a scientific attitude or a quest for knowledge, and there is a questioning mindset of people which is emerging in such a society. And what are the features of such a society? There is economic progress, modern education is being imparted to the people in the society, so economic progress becomes an accepted social value, and the change of human mind is taking place as they are able to think about their respective countries. New enterprises are emerging. The objective is to establish a firm or industry and produce output for a long time. Investments are taking place. New infrastructure is getting created. In other words, modern science and technology has made forays into the so-called traditional society, and that provides the precondition for takeoff to the next stage, which is the stage that all developing countries are supposed to lead to. Now, apart from these characteristics, the other conditions of the preconditions for takeoff stage is that creation of credit institutions. Sufficient credit institutions may be created, for example, the banking system, the financial system, so that investments can take place within the economy. Mobilization of workforce. Due to industrialization, a large proportion of workforce can be shifted from agriculture to the manufacturing sector, and this is something which was experienced in Britain in the time of industrialization, the post-industrialization period, and so on. Another characteristic is again the progress of modern science and technology that can bring down birth rates. So medical science is supposed to be slowly developing during the preconditions to take off. Citizens are supposed to understand the essence of control of birth rate and bringing down death rates. At first, the death rate is to be controlled, and then the birth rate is to be controlled. So the second stage is a stage of demographic transition which is experienced by the developed countries, where population growth is high because both death rates and a population is stabilizing because both death rates and birth rates are declining. Also, political power is centralized based on nationalism, replacing the land-based localistic or colonial power. Now, after the preconditions for the takeoff stage, the takeoff stage is basically, it marks the transition of the society, traditional society, from a backward to one which is on the verge of freeing itself from the elements that bring down its growth. And it is one stage in which there is a dynamic change in the society, and there is a meteoric rise in the standards set by the members of society in industry, in agriculture, science and technology, medicine, etc. And this is the path of development that was taken by the highly industrialized nations of the world. And for a large part of the 1950s and the 1960s, development literature actually focused on trying to devise development policies or economic policies that can at least bring about the transition of the so-called less developed countries from the traditional society stage to the stage of takeoff. So there are certain sophisticated characteristics of this takeoff stage as well. First is the rate of investment. The takeoff stage should have very high rates of investment. For this purpose, and for example, in India, after the attainment of independence, rate of investment was increased in the economy by carrying out a policy of industrialization. Then the second characteristic is development of one leading sector, and invariably in the takeoff stage, the sector which receives the largest investment is the industrial sector, and existence of different frameworks in the society. So there is existence of political, social and institutional framework which exploit impulses to expansion in the modern sector, and the potential external economies affect the takeoff and give the process of growth a sustained and cumulative character. The fourth stage is the stage of drive to maturity. Maturity in the context of Rostow's theory basically means that a society is advancing on all fronts, and each and every effort to stimulate the economy meets with success, and the time period when the society tastes success is a rather long one, and progress made on all fronts is there to stay. There are certain economic characters of this stage. One is there is a shift in occupational distribution. For example, due to industrial revolution, many industries were established in Britain and in Western European countries. The workforce shifted from agricultural to the manufacturing sector. This drive to maturity is one where the shift from agriculture to the manufacturing sector is taking place or has taken place to a very large extent. And this is something which is being seen, which was claimed was being seen in the context of many so-called underdeveloped countries in the 1970s and the 1980s, when the boost to industrialization was taking place. The second economic character of this drive to maturity, there is a shift in consumption pattern. A new type of workforce gets created that are termed as white-collared workers, and they are mainly officials or managing officials of factories governing body. They, due to high income, their preferences also shift to necessaries, from necessaries to luxury goods. They are consuming more of comfort and luxury goods. As a result, the consumption pattern of non-agricultural goods also increase, and this lead to development of existing industries and variation in tastes and preferences taking place more rapidly in this period. There is also a shift in consumption of the leading sector. The change in composition was observed to vary from country to country. For example, the Swedish takeoff was initiated by timber exports, wood pulp and paste board products, followed by the emergence of railways, hydropower, steel and animal husbandry and dairy products. So different countries may experience different kinds of development in this drive to maturity. There has to be one leading sector which takes the country, which moves the country towards economic development. There are certain non-economic factors of the drive to maturity which were also identified by Rostow. One is entrepreneurial leadership, which is one of the important drivers of this stage in drive to maturity. And the final stage of Rostow's stages of growth was the very high stage of mass consumption, where people are consuming mass. It is a consumerist society, and there is very high consumption of consumer goods and services and so on. Now, there is a lot of critique of the stages of growth theory, and I will like to pinpoint one of the criticisms that has been dealt with very severely in the 1990s and the 2000s particularly, is that the stages of growth that was propounded by Rostow has not been uniform in the so-called developing countries of the world. Even today we see the coexistence of the traditional and the modern sector, and this is something which is also the criticism that was put forward as a challenge to Lewis' model of dual sector of agriculture and industry. So there is a lot of, so there is a coexistence of the traditional and the modern sector. So the takeoff to the high stage of growth, where there is only consumption of high consumption of goods and services, a highly consumerist society, has actually not taken place in many of the developing countries of the world. Although as far as the highly industrialized nations of the world are concerned, for example Japan, some of it may prove to be true. Therefore, the Rostow's stages of economic growth model lost its appeal among many economists, particularly in the post 1980s and 1990s period. Now, having given you a brief overview of what are the basic characteristics of Schumpeter's and Rostow's growth theories or theories of economic development, let me run you through some of the very basic concepts which one needs to know to be able to have a good grasp over the growth models. In the last lecture, I used the term referred to as multiplier and accelerator while I was discussing Hirschman's thesis of unbalanced growth. Now let me very briefly introduce to you what is a multiplier. So in economics, when we are dealing with growth models or macroeconomic aggregates, we are referring to the Keynesian multiplier. This is a concept which was worked on by Keynes. It was popularized by Keynes. It was first developed by an economist called F.A. Khan in the early 1930s, but Keynes refined it, and it basically means it is multiplier is usually shown in the form of a ratio, and this is basically a ratio of change in income to change in investment. So K is equal to delta Y by delta I. Here delta I stands for increment in investment and delta Y stands for the resultant increase in income, and multiplier is basically the ratio of increment in income to the increment in investment. So whenever there is an investment taking place in the economy, what is the rate at which income changes and what are the forces that increases this income is what is captured by the multiplier. If as a result of, for example, if as a result of investment of rupees 100 crores, the national income increases by rupees 300 crores, then the multiplier is equal to 3. If as a result of investment of rupees 100 crores, total national income increases by rupees 400 crores, multiplier is 4. So the multiplier is therefore a ratio of increment in income to increment in investment, and delta I stands for increment in investment and delta Y stands for increment in income. The question is why the increase in income is many times more than the initial increase in investment. Suppose government undertakes investment expenditure equal to rupees 100 crores on, say, some public works, construction of rural roads. For this, government will pay wages to the laborers engaged, prices for the materials to the suppliers, and remunerations to other factors who make contribution to the work of road building. So the total cost will amount to rupees 100 crores, and this will increase incomes of people equal to rupees 100 crores. But this is not all. The people who receive 100 crores will spend a good part of them on consumer goods. Therefore, some marginal propensity to consume of the people will increase, and this 100 crores they will spend, let us say of this 100 crores they will spend rupees 80 crores on consumer goods, which would increase incomes of these people who supply consumer goods equal to rupees 80 crores. And with every additional increase in income, there will be progressive less, since a part of the income received will be saved. Thus, income will increase by only rupees 100 crores, which was initially invested in the construction of roads, but by many more times. So the concept of multiplier is very important in macroeconomic understanding of growth and how growth take place within the economy. Corresponding to the multiplier, there is a concept of accelerator. The accelerator basically measures the changes in investment goods industry as a result of long-term changes in demand in consumption goods industries. So the principle of acceleration states that if the demand for consumption goods rises, there will be an increase in the demand for equipments and machines which produce these goods. But the demand for machines will increase at a faster rate than the increase in demand for the product. The principle of acceleration enables us to understand the process of income generation more clearly. A certain level of income could be attained by multiplier action alone, but along with accelerator, the process of income propagation is speeded up. So for example, in the last class when I was referring to Hirschman's thesis of creating excess capacity within the economy by investing in social overhead capital, and the external economies arising out of the social overhead capital being appropriated by the private entities to be able to enter into directly productive activities, we are referring to the accelerator principle here, where the principle of acceleration creates a situation in the economy where the private entities can take advantage of the external economies created out of the creation of social overhead capital. You can also look at accelerator as a functional relationship between the demand for consumption goods and demand for machines which make them, and usually the acceleration coefficient nu is equal to the change in investment to the change in consumption expenditure, and it primarily depends upon two factors: the capital output ratio and the durability of the capital equipment. Let us also very briefly look at what is capital output ratio and the incremental capital output ratio. For example, if I put you a question that why is the rate of economic growth falling in India, and one of the explanations you would give is that the savings rate in the country is falling, and lower the savings and investment rate will lead to lower growth. Now, so economic growth in any country, among other things, is a function of the level of savings and the rate of investment, and any additional investment required to increase output is termed as the incremental capital output ratio. So it is basically a metric that assesses marginal amount of investment capital necessary for an entity to generate the next unit of production. So for example, if a 10% additional capital is required to push the overall output by 1%, the ICOR or the incremental capital output ratio will be 10. Lower the ICOR, the better it is. ICOR reflects how efficiently capital is being used to generate additional output. So a country with ICOR of 3 is better than a country with ICOR of 5. So you can look at it. The growth rate and the savings ratio and the incremental capital output ratio, if G is equal to S by V is the mathematical relationship between growth rate, savings rate and the incremental capital output ratio. This concept of capital output ratio I will discuss again when we are discussing the Harrod-Domar model in the next classes. The capital output ratio is often used as an investment criterion, and it plays a very key role in the Harrod-Domar model of growth. Let us also briefly look at the savings and investment relationship that I have also spoken about in the last class for the benefit of most of you. Let us first begin with a two-sector model. We are assuming here that equilibrium occurs when income received equals aggregate desired expenditures. So one of the first identities that we are working out is income is nothing but a summation of consumption expenditures plus investment expenditures. So y is equal to C plus I. Now if you recall the national income identities that we had briefly looked in the first lecture of this course, I had said that GNP or GDP can be calculated by the income method and the product method. So when we are looking at GNP, it could mean income or it could mean product. So as aggregate output and income are always equal and consumption is identical in both places, the rest of the equation must also be equal. So if y is equal to C plus I, which is income is equal to consumption plus investment, and Q or output, which is the gross national product, is nothing but the summation of consumption and savings, and if y is equal to Q, then C plus S is equal to C plus I. So in the ultimate identity in a two-sector model without international trade, we consider savings to be equal to investment. So whatever is getting leaked out of the system is getting injected back into the system in the form of investments. So basically GDP comprises of consumption, investment, government spending and net exports. C plus I plus G plus xn or x minus m, you may consider both, which is basically exports minus imports, the net of exports. That is the total GDP, that gives you the total output or total income within the economy. And C is the largest sector of GDP. So consumption is mostly the largest sector of a country, and consumption function states that as income rises, consumption, usually we can also refer to, when we say consumption function, we are basically saying that consumption is a function of income. So if income rises, by how much consumption rises. And although there is a linear relationship between consumption and income, as income rises, consumption rises, but not as quickly. So similarly, consumption also varies with disposable income, which is basically income, total income minus the taxes. I will end this lecture with two more basic concepts that we use, which is, one is the concept of average propensity to consume and the concept of average propensity to save. So there are two ways to view the consumption income relationship. One is as a ratio of total consumption to total disposable income, and the second is as a relationship of changes in consumption to changes in disposable income. Average propensity to consume is basically the total consumption divided by the total disposable income, and average propensity to save is total savings divided by the total disposable income. Similarly, the concept of marginal propensity to consume, which is looking at a ratio of change in consumption to change in income. With regard to investment, there are two important concepts which needs to be kept in mind. One is autonomous investment and the second is induced investment. Autonomous investment is not sensitive to changes in income. In other words, it is independent of income changes and is not guided or induced by profit motive only. And autonomous investments are primarily made by the government and are not based on considerations of profit. And induced investment is that investment which changes with the change in income, and that is why it is called income elastic. In a free enterprise capitalist economy, investments are induced by profit motive, and such investment is very responsive to changes in income, that is, induced investment increases as income increases. So to end today's lecture, in today's lecture we looked at two important strategies of economic development, one proposed by Professor Joseph Schumpeter and the other by W. Rostow. Schumpeter's strategy of development can be categorized under the development thought characterized as universal history, where economic history is considered to be taken as one of the pillars in which the economic development strategies can be analyzed. Schumpeter provided a big role to innovation and entrepreneurship in creating discontinuity within the circular flow of static equilibrium system, such that economic development can take place. Rostow was focusing on 5 stages of economic growth. Again, based upon, Rostow was considered to be a structuralist. He was proposing a structural model where, based upon the example of the highly industrialized nations of the world, his proposition was that all countries necessarily need to pass these 5 stages of economic growth. However, Rostow's proposition has also faced various criticisms, particularly in the 90s and in the 1980s and the 2000s, because the experience of the developing countries have shown us that the traditional sector and the modern sector coexist, and the takeoff stage has never really been reached by the developing countries of the world. In the next class, we will look at taking off from the balanced and unbalanced growth model and Rostow's and Schumpeter's ideas on economic development. We will look at the big push theory, what were the major concerns of the big push theory, or what were the major proposals made by the big push theory, and we'll also look at the critical minimum efforts thesis as proposed by Professor Liebenstein. Thank you.